Thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. I want to congratulate Carol and Debbie and the team on setting up a marvellous support group for Usher syndrome. And I wish you all the very best for your first virtual Usher syndrome Ireland online meeting. So I work as a genetic counsellor in the clinical genetics department in the Mater Hospital. We set up the clinical department in the Mater Hospital to provide genetic counselling for those patients who are tested as part of Target 5000. I also work in the rare disease office, so I want to talk to you a little bit about rare disease generally, because Usher is a rare disease. So why attend for genetic counselling? So people attend because they either want a diagnosis or they want to confirm a diagnosis. For Usher syndrome, the diagnosis is normally established by the time they come for genetic counselling. Either the person has been deaf since birth, or they start to develop visual loss, and then they start to develop visual loss, or the person has visual loss followed by a loss of hearing. Target 5000 provides an equitable, standardised level of care for patients. So up to this, before Target 5000, patients would go abroad to be tested or would actually use their own money in order to test themselves. So this was why it was set up in the first place. We've tested about 1,600 patients so far, and it's estimated that there's about 2,600 patients with inherited retinal disease in Ireland. So genetic testing for Usher is now mainly through Target 5000. And this is a research project which is now being brought into the clinical domain. For those that have been tested as part of Target 5000, we found the gene for Usher syndrome in about 80% of those people diagnosed with Usher. And in about 5% of other people, we found one gene change, and we expect to find another when we continue searching. And that's based on a patient cohort of about 145. So the second reason people will come would to find that if you discover the gene, you then will know how the condition is inherited. Now for Usher syndrome, it's inherited in an autosomal recessive manner, and I'll show you a picture of that in a little while. So for Target 5000, there's 3 prongs to the Target 5000 study. First of all, patients are placed on a register. Then they are reviewed every 2 years so that we have a knowledge of the course of the condition and the prognosis, but also so that we can pick up any of those secondary complications that patients with retinitis pigmentosa can get. And then when you're on the register, then we have access to drugs and therapies down the line because we'll have your details on our register. And the first bit is actually testing the gene. And so genetic counselling, what I found is that it really serves to assess patients from where they are from a psychological and supportive perspective as well. So it's really lovely to meet patients in clinic because you get a much better feel for how patients are doing. So I just want to talk a little bit about the human genome, and I don't want to put you all off because I know it can be complicated, but basically inside every cell of our body is DNA, and DNA is a code for all the genes that we need. And genes are like recipes for making proteins that make our bodies work and function. And we've got about 3 billion DNA base pairs in every cell of our body, all originating from that first fertilized egg cell that divided to make us. And in that 3 billion base pairs, there's 23,000 genes. And those genes, as I said, a lot of them make proteins that make our bodies work. And they actually only make up 1 to 2% of our total DNA. And when I started in genetics, we thought all the rest of it was what we call junk DNA. And we now know it's not junk. We know that this DNA has important regulatory functions. And I was at the Irish Society of Human Genetics conference yesterday, and we were all talking about what's present outside the genes, because that's really the big area at the moment. And the difference between us is about 3 to 5 billion variants. So we have changes in our genome, all of us. And some of those changes actually cause disease. Some of them don't matter, doesn't make any difference. And some of them are actually beneficial. So as a species, we're evolving all the time. So we have variants, and variants are very much a part of our genome. And when we look to find a mistake in the genes, we're looking to find a variant which is actually stopping the gene from working. So stopping the recipe from making the protein. And so all the patients on the Target 5000 study, they were subjected to a panel where we looked at 254 genes. And those 254 genes all cause inherited retinal dystrophy. We've now moved to a blueprint genetic panel, and there's about 322 genes. And we're pretty sure we have most of the genes now. And any time a patient doesn't have a genetic diagnosis, so that we can't find a confirmatory gene, we're pretty sure we just missed it. You know, that it's maybe in one of those regulatory non-coding regions, or maybe we've missed it within the gene itself. And so you've probably heard of chromosomes. I just want to bring up chromosomes because it can be abstract. So the chromosomes, we've got 23 pairs of chromosomes. We've got 22 autosomes numbered 1 to 22. And then we have an X and a Y. And if we're a boy, we have an X and a Y. And if we're a girl, we have two X's. And we get one of each of our chromosomes from each of our parents. And the chromosomes contain the genes. So we get half our genetic material from our mother and half our genetic material from our dad. And therefore we have one gene from our mum and one gene from our dad. And we have two of every gene, okay? So you've got two Usher genes, one that you get from your mum and one you get from your dad, okay? So Usher syndrome is a rare condition, and I'll talk about rare disorders in a little while. It was first described in 1858, but it actually gets its name from a Scottish doctor called Charles Usher. And he really described that it was hereditary, and that he described the recessive pattern of inheritance, which I'll talk about in a minute. As regards prevalence, there's about 3 to 17 people per 100,000 have Usher syndrome. There are areas in the world where it's more common. There are types that are more common than other types. Especially type 3 can be there can be areas where this is more common than other areas. There's no evidence that Usher syndrome is more common in Ireland than elsewhere, although we don't have a rare disease register. We do have our Target 5000 register. And if we look at Usher syndrome, the RP from Usher syndrome and people with RP because of Usher syndrome make up 18% of all RP. And if we look at our Irish data, nearly 12.5% of all IRDs are because of Usher syndrome, okay? And 50% of global deaf and legally blind population is because of Usher syndrome. So that dual sensory impairment. And then we've got 3 to 13% of congenitally deaf children are because of Usher syndrome. So there's other reasons why, and other genes that can cause deafness, but 3 to 13% are caused by Usher syndrome. There's 4 clinical subtypes of Usher syndrome. So Usher syndrome type 1 can cause profound sensory neural hearing loss from birth. Those children can have balance problems. So often they're very slow to walk. They might not walk until they're 18. And they can have vision problems from 10 or early teens. And this can be variable. So there can be a variable age of onset of those visual problems, usually starting with night vision problems. Usher syndrome type 2, you have moderate to severe hearing loss, which can worsen over time. And you've got onset of visual problems starts around the teens to the early 20s. And people with Usher syndrome type 2, they don't tend to have the balance problems that people with Usher syndrome type 1 have. And then Usher syndrome type 3, you have the retinitis pigmentosa presents in the 2nd to 4th decade, and you might have hearing loss later. And you may have variable balance problems. And then Usher syndrome type 4 is late onset retinopathy with variable sensory neural hearing loss. And the visual problems associated with Usher syndrome type 2 tend to progress more slowly than those associated with type 1. So I've talked a little bit about genetics and genes and sequencing. But Usher syndrome is associated with about 10, well, at least 10 main genes, but up to 14 genes can cause Usher syndrome. And so these are just the genes that can cause Usher syndrome type 1, type 2, and type 3. But there are also those people with Usher syndrome who we haven't been able to find the genetic cause. And of the Usher syndrome type 1, 40% of cases of Usher syndrome is because of type 1, and about 60% of cases of Usher syndrome is because of type 2. And biallelic USH2A gene alterations account for about 80% of those cases. And Usher syndrome type 3 is about 3%, and type 4 less than 1%. If we look at the Irish data, so I have some Irish data based on the Trinity panel of 254 genes, and there's about 145 people in that study. About 25% of them had Usher syndrome type 1, and about 75% had Usher syndrome type 2, with about 1.5% with Usher type 3, and about 0.7% with Usher type 4. And the two genes that account for over 80% of cases is USH2A, Usher syndrome type 2, and MY07A, which accounts for Usher type 1. So autosomal recessive inheritance is where you have carrier mum and a carrier dad. So they both have one gene that isn't working, accounted for by the little or here. And they have one gene that works, accounted for the big or, by the big or. And we all carry genes that don't work, every single one of us. It's estimated that 1 in 3 of us carry a recessive eye condition. So, it's not uncommon to be a carrier for recessive conditions. So here we have one big or and one little or, so both carrier parents. So each pregnancy, the dad could pass on the chromosome with the or that's working, the big or, and the mum could pass on the chromosome with the or that's working, the big or, and you have a child that doesn't have Usher and doesn't carry it. Or the dad could pass on the gene with the Usher syndrome, and the mum could pass on an Usher syndrome gene that's working, and you have a child that's a carrier, and the same the other way around. Or the dad could pass on the small or, the gene that isn't working, and the mum could pass on the small or, the gene that isn't working, and you have a child affected by Usher syndrome. So if you have Usher syndrome, it's most likely your parents carry it. And for your parents, there would have been a 1 in 4 chance of them having a child with this condition. So that means your brothers and sisters have a 2, if they don't have Usher syndrome, there's a 2 in 3 chance of them carrying it. And that's where we get that figure from. And then here is somebody who has Usher syndrome, and I'm afraid it's only a girl. I know there's boys that have Usher syndrome too, but this diagram just shows a female. So she's 2 genes, neither of which work. And the likelihood of her meeting somebody who carries this condition would be quite small. And so therefore, we wouldn't expect any of their children to be affected by this condition. But there is a limited amount of testing that we can do. So what do these genes do? So some of these make proteins that help specialized cells called hair cells transmit sound from the inner ear to the brain. And these specialized cells also are photoreceptors, so they sense light and color in the retina of the eye. But the function of some of the proteins of these genes is not known. So there's no definitive cure for Usher syndrome as yet. There have been many clinical trials, and I've just put up a reference here, www.clinicaltrials.gov. But there's been great interest with numerous trials that have taken place. Some of these are natural history trials, and a natural history trial is very important in itself because we have markers for treatment trials down the line. So they're very important and shouldn't be discounted as not being that important. Then some trials replace the gene product. Some involve putting a DNA patch on an area of gene that has a mistake and making a shortened copy of the protein. And some of the actual mistakes in the gene stop the gene from making the protein. So it only makes a very short protein because it comes across a code that says stop making the protein. And so some therapies or some treatments can actually read through those that stop code and make the protein. So there's been quite a few different trials that have taken place. I should say that 95% of rare diseases do not have an approved treatment. There is quite a long way to go when there's a treatment. So first you have to go for the clinical trial phase, and there's about phase 1 to phase 3 of clinical trials. Then you need to get the treatment licensed. So you have to prove that it's been a clinical benefit and that it's safe, and that's what you do in your clinical trials. Then you need to get it, so you get it licensed by the European Medicines Agency or the FDA in America. And then you need to get your government to fund the treatment. So it needs to be reimbursed. So, but there are modifiable things that we can do. So if we look at auditory, you can have cochlear implants, hearing aids. When we're looking at the vision, we can fix the cataracts. The cystoid macular lesions, we can treat with either drops or tablets. We can give lenses, or we can actually operate for refraction problems. And then there's the low vision aid. So there's lots we can do. Secondary complications, we've got, obviously you can have treatment for the refractive error, but for all inherited retinal dystrophies, there are issues that you can get with your eyes that actually prevent you having your best possible vision. And cataracts, 77.4% of people with Usher syndrome can develop cataracts, and about 27% have these cystoid macular lesions. So it is really important that we see people every couple of years so that we can check that they don't have these secondary complications and that they do have their best possible vision. And those figures are actually from our 145 patients that we've analysed with Usher syndrome. So the 77% and the approximately 27%. So Usher syndrome is a rare disease. And a rare disease is defined as something that affects less than 1 in 2,000 people. There are about 6,000 rare diseases, and about 6% of the population is affected by rare disease. So that means there's about 300,000 people in Ireland with a rare disease. 72% of these conditions are genetic. They can be chronic and multisystemic. And as I said, only 5% have a drug therapy as yet. And so this is a picture of Ireland, about 4.5 million. I think we've reached 5 million now, and about 300,000 people affected with rare disease. And there's been plenty of different strategies for rare disease in Ireland. We had the model of care. We also had the National Rare Disease Plan, first of all, and then the model of care. And we had Sláinte Care. And we also have this United Nations system shared framework for action, which is all about leaving no one behind, equality and non-discrimination at the heart of sustainable development. And so the Rare Disease Office was established as part of the National Rare Disease Plan. And I work there 1 day a week. And what the Rare Disease Office does is, the first thing we do is we try and find out the expertise for different rare diseases. And then we put their centres of expertise up on a database called OrphanNet. And of the centres of expertise, one of those centres will be the leading centre for that rare disease in the country. So we do have, one of the networks is called I, and we have ERNI. And in the Matter, we are the lead centre for eye conditions in the country. It's actually a joint venture. So it's the Matter, it's the Ioneer Hospital and Temple Street. But it is, but the lead is Professor Keegan for ERNI. And that the function of the ERN is that, you know, if another center of expertise has a question about the condition, that they can go to the lead center in the country to see if they have the answer. And if they don't have the answer, they can seek guidance from expertise abroad. So it allows, also the ERNs will provide standard treatment guidelines. So the treatment, so the EU, at an EU level, will be deciding on the best treatment for different conditions. It'll also allow us to share knowledge with each other so that, you know, that people in Europe, in centres in Europe, aren't getting a better service than patients in Ireland. There's always that concern that, you know, that the service might be better elsewhere. You're also increasing the diagnosis of rare disease, because some rare diseases, you know, it's hard to diagnose. And if it's a very unusual symptoms, you can go to your lead centre and then go to your ERN centres in Europe and see if they can diagnose your patient. But it's also going to be very useful for research, and we're going to collaborate much more effectively and share data and information with each other, which will mean much better learning, and also for training and for education. And in the Rare Disease Office, we've been developing care plans for rare disease. And a care plan is, you know, working out what is the best treatment from when somebody has been diagnosed throughout the management of their condition. And it's been developed with patients and patient support groups and with clinical expertise. So we've mapped out the care plan for patients with Usher syndrome, and it's actually at the final stages of development, that care plan. I just want to mention the Rare Disease Register. Obviously, we have a register for Target 5000, but we've no rare disease register here. And so that's really important for other rare diseases, that we have a register. We can't lobby effectively for services if we don't know the numbers of people who are affected by rare disease in the country. And that's the same for Usher syndrome. I mean, we know the patients with Usher syndrome that are on the Target 5000 study, but we don't know, have we got everyone with Usher syndrome? And a way of doing that is ensuring that rare diseases are properly coded. And so that when we have, eventually, when we have electronic health records, we'll have a properly coded ORFA code, which will code for Usher syndrome. And we'll then know how many patients with Usher syndrome there are in the country. And we're not going to be able to attract the attention of pharmaceutical companies and research companies unless we have those numbers. It's very hard to attract the attention and say how many patients you have in the country with a particular rare disease. And ORFA codes are the codes that we want to use, because a lot of the time, I know I did a study on working with GPs at one stage, and I went and asked them about rare diseases, and you know, they use ICD-10 codes, and that actually, there's only a code, an ICD-10 code for 8% of rare diseases. So for the vast majority of rare diseases, there's no code. So there's no way of coding those people in the GP. So the ORFA code allows for 100% of rare disease coding. And just to say that the Rare Disease Office also provides an information line, and this is the number for the information line. And the information line, and there's an email address there. The information line is for rare disease patients that are stuck in their journey. We provide information on the condition and also signposting to expertise and other services when patients are kind of lost or stuck. So thank you.